Good evening, everybody. Good to see all of you here this evening. I've got a couple of announcements to make before we start class. Please announce the prison ministry training on September 22nd at Fraser Methodist Church for people who have not met their training requirements for this calendar year, and it may be the last opportunity to do so. So if you're planning on working in the prison ministry, hadn't done your training, September 22nd. Other announcement, the fall men's prison ministry schedule is available in both foyers. So those are the announcements I was asked to make, and I wanted to do that. I want to say thank you to the elders and those who were in charge of last Sunday. I just thought last Sunday was wonderful. It was great to see John Hazlip and hear him. It was wonderful to hear E.R. Brandon again. It was great. I just thoroughly loved it, and I appreciate the elders doing that. It meant a lot to me to get to see both those old guys. John was a preacher at East Ridge, where I grew up when I was in high school, before he came down here. I'll tell you one little story about John. I had a crush on this girl in high school. I had had a crush on her for years, and she was always going with somebody. Never could I get a chance to ask her out. She was the head cheerleader, Miss East Ridge. I just thought she was it. Well, finally, my senior year, she broke up with this guy. And I said, hey, what have I got to lose? So I asked her out. She said yes. And I walked in, and I told her I was going to take her to the thing at church, and then we were going to go see a movie. And, man, I walked in that room, and I was 7 foot tall and bulletproof, man, because I had Karen on one arm, and I was it. It was just great. And John walked up to me, and I said, Karen, this is our minister, John Hazlip. John, I want you to meet Karen. I told you about her. And he looked at her, and he said, why, Mitch, she's not near as bow-legged as you said she was. Closest I've ever come to hitting a preacher. I couldn't believe he said that. But he did, but it worked out okay. We had a few dates and had a good time. But I was so upset. So upset. Okay, we're going to talk about evolution this week and next week. And the topic is evolution, fact, or fiction. I want you to be sure that you differentiate between organic and expected evolution. There's a huge difference. Is man evolving today? It's not a trick question. Is man evolving today? Yes, we are evolving because we're changing. We're changing. If you look at men today and compare it to men 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we've changed. We have changed. We've gotten bigger and stronger. We are evolving, But it's not organic evolution. Organic evolution says that something came from nothing and changed after it got here. So be sure when you talk about evolution that you talk about separate those two concepts. Organic evolution is what kids are being taught in school today as fact, when it isn't. Regular evolution is what we normally go through today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get through the lesson. But be sure you know the difference between the two, because there is a difference when we talk about evolution. I believe in evolution, but I don't believe in organic evolution. We are changing, but we're not changing organically, as our atheist friends would say. The Encyclopedia Britannica lists 22 different theories of evolution. Did you know that? 22 different theories of evolution are taught in the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's amazing, isn't it? 22 different ways that man has evolved. They can't even get the same way. They can get on the same page themselves. Evolutionists can't, because they believe there's 22 different theories of how we have evolved over the years. Let's talk about some of the most dominant theories of evolution. Number one is the atheistic evolution, which says no God ever existed and that the natural universe and its laws originated by chance. Now, if we looked at the three main different types of evolution, which one do you think is the one that's the most commonly taught in universities today? Atheistic evolution. Atheistic evolution. No God. It all happened by chance. over a period of millions of years. Second one is that some people are deistic evolutionists. They believe that the process of evolution is controlled by a great impersonal mind. They believe God created this universe and has allowed it to evolve. One of our most famous founding fathers was a deist. Anybody know who that was? Thomas Jefferson, yeah. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. It's sometimes called the old clockwinder God. That God created this world, he wound it up like a clock, and then he set it down on the table, walked off, and left it. And that's what deistic evolutionists believe. I didn't mean to go back one, I'm sorry. Then you have theistic evolutionists. I don't see how you can put those two together. Because theism means what? God. I don't see how you can put God evolution together, but there are some people who are theistic evolutionists who believe that God personally guides the evolutionary process. That it's happened this way because that's the way God wanted it to be. We have evolved because that was God's plan. Totally unbiblical, isn't it? Totally unbiblical. But there are people who are theistic evolutionists. They still believe in God, but they want to tie that to the evolutionary process. The modern theory of evolution started in 1859 when a guy named Charles Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of Species. He had two main points in his writing, and that was survival of the fittest and natural selection. Those are his two main concepts as he talked about evolution. Another possible theory was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. I have heard evolutionists say that the reason giraffes have a long neck is because over the millenniums, as they ate on the trees, the bottom limbs were devoid of foliation, so they had to eat the next level. And then that one got devoid of foliation, and they had to reach the next level, and then that one got out of it. And to reach the higher level, they stretched their necks. And that's how giraffes got long necks. What do you think happened to baby giraffes? Baby giraffes aren't born with long necks like Mommy and Daddy are. They got long necks, but not to the extent Mommy and Daddy are. They couldn't even reach those limbs. But inherited characteristics is another concept. Snakes. Evolutionists believe that most snakes had legs at one time. But to hide from their predators and to get into holes, the legs became extemporaneous. They didn't need them anymore. So over a period of millennium, the legs just disappeared. They don't have them anymore because they don't need them anymore. A scientist, and his name's in the book, I didn't write it down, I didn't think y'all would really want to know, but he decided he had tested out this concept of inherited characteristics, acquired characteristics. So he took lab rats and cut their tails off. And when the baby rats came, guess what they had? They had tails. Yeah. So he cut those tails off. When they had babies, guess what their babies had? Tails. Did it for 22 generations. He could have kept on going, couldn't he? He could have kept on going because that was never going to be an inherited characteristic. You know, that's part of the way rats are. They're going to have tails. No matter you cut them off now, you can't breed a tail off of a rat. You just can't do it because there's no such thing as inherited characteristics. But there are a lot of people, evolutionary, who think that is a very, very important concept. Many scientists that are evolutionists believe on the mutation theory. The mutation theory. Now, this is one reason that evolutionists press so hard to say how long the earth has been around. That it's been 5 million, 15 million, 22 million, a billion years, because it takes time to allow those mutations to come into being and have an impact. The reason things have changed is because it was a mutation. It's specifically proven that mutations occur, it's true, but in minute details. And beneficial mutations hardly ever occur. Hardly ever is a mutation beneficial. And even if that mutation is beneficial, guess what happens the next generation? It's not there anymore because it's not an inherited characteristic. That mutation is not there. I had a good friend growing up whose daddy had a big mutation on his neck. Looked like he had a softball on his neck. Well, my friend didn't have that. He grew up. His children don't have that. But if you gave him 20 million years, maybe that mutation would occur again. And that's why evolutionists want that long, long period of time. So they'll have time for those mutations to occur again. Mutations do occur, but they're almost always neutral or harmful. They don't add at all to what our world is like today. They're never, and also they never produce new organs. They may be mutations of an existing organ, but they're never a new organ. Went to high school with a kid who was born with his spleen on the wrong side. Wasn't it over here? It was supposed to be over here. I don't know. Well, anyway, his spleen was on the wrong side of his body. That's a mutation, isn't it? That's a mutation. Had no effect on his life. No effect. Spleen worked fine where it was. But it was just different. It was a neutral mutation. He got married. His children had their spleens on the same side I do. You know, it didn't last. It never changes organs. Okay, let's talk about thermodynamics just a little bit. I'm not a physicist. I preface these remarks with that up front. I am not a physicist. If I were a physicist, I could probably do a much better job of talking about the laws of thermodynamics, but I'm not. You just got to get by what I got. Okay? Two laws of thermodynamics, the first law and the second law. But both of them teach that the earth is not getting better. Now, if you're an evolutionist, you'd say what? Things getting better. We're evolving up the scale. Everything's getting better. The climate's getting better. The earth's getting better. Everything's getting better because of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Everything's getting better. And that's just not the case. It's not the case. It appears that it's the opposite way. The second law of thermodynamics states that there must always be a decrease in order or organization. Always a decrease in order or organization. I'd like for somebody to read 2 Peter 3, 9 through 13 for me good and loud. 2 Peter 3, 9 through 13. Now this was Peter's explanation of the world coming to a close. When the world was going to end. Okay? 2 Peter 3, 9 through 13. Who's got it?
The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise. Some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, that all should reach repentance. For the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Then the heavens will pass away with a roar. The heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. The earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people will you be as lives of holiness and godliness?
Okay. So Peter says, what's going to happen? This earth's going to cease to exist, isn't it? The earth's going to cease to exist. It's just not going to be anymore. It's not going to continue to evolve and get better and better and better and better. It's going in the other direction. You know, I mentioned the other day in one of the classes that they've decided now that the sun's going to quit shining in 93 million years. I don't want that to stress y'all out. I want you to stress y'all out. You got a little while to worry about that one, But it is getting less. It's not getting bigger. It's getting less. Some say, well, but what about the sunspots? And those are mutations, and they're not positive mutations. They're negative mutations. Sun is getting less, and one of these days, the sun's not going to shine anymore. We'll all be gone because we've got to have the sun to live. Okay? But Peter says the day's coming like a thief in the night when the earth is going to burn up. I don't know when that is. The Bible doesn't tell us when. Because nobody knows. Only God knows. He didn't even tell his son. He knows. And I'm not sure when it's going to be, but I tell you what, there's not going to be any escaping it when he does. When it happens, it's happening. It's not going to be, 2 weeks from tomorrow, the world's going to come to an end. No. It'll come like a thief in the night. It's going to happen without all that announcements that's going on. And it's going to happen because everything's getting less organized, not more organized, as our evolutionary friends want to say. Now let's talk about the fixity of species. The fixity of species. A lot of folks get tangled up with the fact that there are species, but that word's never mentioned in the Bible. What's mentioned in the Bible? Kind. Not species, but kind. Everything produces after its own kind. Okay? Now, we could go and have a taxonometry chart, and I started to put one of those there, and I said, no, they won't be interested in that. But it talks about all the different things. The phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. Did anybody have to learn those when you were in biology class in high school or college? Your biology teacher said, okay, here's a bat. Where does it go? Here's a dog. Where does it go? Here's a sunflower. Where does it go? And you can do it by classifications that they've made, but those are not after its own kind. Those are distinct species. I think the book says that there are 4 phyla of plants and 20 phyla of animals. But you know those plants have stayed the same? If we could find a plant that was 1,000 years old, you know how much it would compare to a plant like that today? It'd be the same. It'd be the same. It wouldn't be different. It'd be the same. I didn't realize until I love to watch things like NCIS, those kind of shows, Did you know that plants have DNA? Did you know that? People have DNA, but so do plants. You can take a plant and find out where that plant is, what part of the country it came from. You can match it by DNA. And the only reason you can do that is because of what? It's always been that way. There's a consistency in that. It hasn't changed. The sunflower today was the same as the sunflower 10,000 years ago. It was a sunflower. Okay? They were after their own kind. We need to be sure we do that. We have a good example of that in that they have found seeds in ancient digs, like at the pyramids, where wheat was buried with the pharaohs. And that wheat could be taken out, planted, and what's it going to grow? Wheat. It's going to grow wheat. Now, it may not grow as much wheat per stalk as our newest wheat does, but it's going to be wheat. You see pictures of the maize of the Native Americans used. You look, one of those poor little pitiful ears of corn. It doesn't have near the kernels on it that our corn does, but it's still corn. It's still corn. And same thing with what they found. The Hebrew word is mean, which is best described as kinds, not species. Kinds, not species. My biggest question for my evolutionist friends is, where are the transitional forms? Where are the transitional forms? Dogs have always been dogs. Cats have always been cats. Now you got big cats, little cats, tall cats, short cats, furry cats, non-furry cats, but they're all cats. You got big dogs, little dogs, white dogs, black dogs. They're still all dogs, you know. You don't see one that's half dog and half bird. You don't see that. There is no transitional form. Scientists have never been able to find something and say, oh, look here. This is where this became that. You know why they can't find it? It doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. There are no transitional forms that would allow evolutionists to say, I can prove this to you. Because they can't. Those forms aren't there. And we got lots of atheistic scientists in this world that are looking for them, don't we? That's what some people say, well, they just hadn't found them yet. Oh, come on. We got scientists that are digging in every corner of the world today, every ocean, everywhere, trying to find that transitional form, because they know if they can find a transitional form, it would be tough on creationists. But you know what? They're not going to find it, because there are none. Never have been, never will be, because God said that they would reproduce after their own kind. Now, the Cambrian period is one of those periods that is on the chart that I didn't print, but I could have, but didn't. But in the Cambrian period, all of a sudden, there were just thousands and thousands and thousands of fossils that appeared. Now, older strata below the Cambrian period, no fossils. It just all of a sudden, at the Cambrian period, boom, there were fossils. I think that might have been when creation took place. That's when the fossils occurred, not before, during the Cambrian period. No clear indication of development. Now, I got one more thought and then we'll be through. I want us to understand the difference between horizontal radiation and vertical change, because it's really, really important. Really, really important. Horizontal radiation are changes within a smaller group. If I take a standard size French poodle and I breed that with a smaller French poodle, what are the children going to be? They're going to be smaller, aren't they? They're going to be smaller. Then I take that one and I breed it with a smaller one. What's that one going to be? Smaller. That's horizontal radiation. Okay? You got regular poodles all the way down to little teacup poodles. They're all poodles. That's horizontal radiation. Still the same dog. Okay? Still the same dog. Hitler believed in that radiation, didn't he? He believed in the supremacy of the Aryan race. Kill all the Jews off and have more Aryan children, there'll be a superhuman race, because they're better, bigger, stronger, faster. Okay? Horizontal radiation. There's nothing wrong with us as Christians believing in horizontal radiation, because it happens. It happens. People pay millions of dollars to racehorses that have been successful to breed their horses, don't they? Those horses make more not racing than they ever made racing, because of the popularity of getting a better horse. They'll still get a horse, but horizontal radiation says they'll get a bigger, faster, stronger horse. So they pay more money to do that. That's horizontal radiation. No problem with that. The problem is when you start talking about vertical change. Vertical change. That's where a dog becomes a horse. That's a vertical change. Now, when a dog gets as big as a horse, and I've seen some dogs just about that size, haven't you? But when that dog becomes a horse, that would be a vertical change. No record of that ever happening. As hard as science has looked, as desperate as evolutionists have been to prove that, they can't prove it because it didn't happen. God told that they would produce after their own kind. And that's what's happened. We talk to an evolutionist sometime, you just ask them, hey, where's the transitional form? Show me that missing link. And you don't have to worry about it because they can't. They can't show it to you. They may show you a mutated form, but it's not a link, because as soon as it got to the next generation, that mutation probably went away. So don't be afraid to talk to them. I tell you what, guys, it takes so much more faith to be an evolutionist than it takes faith to be a Christian. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable, the difference. We are so much more blessed as Christians to say, in the beginning, God created. Because that's what He did. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for all the blessings you've given us. We thank you for the time we had this evening together. We pray, Lord, you'll strengthen us in our belief in you, and we'll look to you for our strength, and we'll share our faith with others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good evening and welcome to our 6:30 Bible class. Glad you're with us this evening. If you haven't had the chance, make sure to grab an announcement sheet on your way out in either of the foyers. One area kind of clarification. Donna Bentley is home, but she still has a long road to recovery. So please keep her in your prayers, and would be good with her not having any family in the area. Just kind of maybe check in on her every so often. If we have enough to kind of take care of her needs, anything she might need. So if you would kind of keep her in mind as she recovers. Of course, we also want to keep in mind of those that are in the path of the hurricane. Keep them in our thoughts and prayers, and then certainly after things have progressed, maybe there will be the opportunity for us to help out as well. But at this point, of course, it's just kind of waiting until the storm happens. Other things and other people, of course, are listed in the bulletin. Please keep them in your prayers and keep those things in mind as well. I've asked Mark to lead us in a word of prayer as we begin. We are in the process of, if this is the first time you've been with us, we're in the process of looking at things related to the end times, things related to last things. And last week we were looking at some of the claims about the state of Israel and the Jewish people, claims that they have some sort of special role to play at the end times. We looked at some of the reasoning for that. And as we finished up last week, we looked at two passages that, one from Paul and one from Revelation, that call that into question. One is that the role of Israel in God's plan, as far as physical Israel, has ended, but that spiritual Israel, as Paul talks about in Romans chapters 9 through 11, has always been those people that approach God through faith. And so that Israel is the Israel that Paul is talking about when he says all Israel will be saved. Well, what does he mean by all Israel? He means all Israel, all those who are children of Abraham through faith. And then we also looked at Revelation chapter 7, the 144,000, how that is a very symbolic number. And when you look at the listing of the 12 tribes there, it's a very odd listing. It doesn't match up with the birth order of Jacob's children. It does not match up with the tribes of Israel, the people that actually had land. And so we should understand that symbolically and not literally, that there will be 144,000 Jews that will suddenly convert before the end of time. But this aspect, perhaps more so than some of the other issues and beliefs about the end times, has had some very distinct political consequences. One of those is the creation of Israel itself. Throughout the 19th century, there were a lot of Jews that desired a homeland. And there was a movement within Judaism known as Zionism, which was trying to work towards having a new Jewish state. But that really began to be successful when some Protestant Christians who bought into this notion of Israel having a role at the end times thought to kind of hasten the timeline, so to speak. And so as these Protestants became very involved politically, both in Great Britain and in the United States, to help create a nation of Israel. And so, there's the creation of Israel itself is connected with these end times. But also, since the 1970s, a lot of our foreign policy related to the Middle East has been shaped by this assumption that Israel as a state, as a nation, has an important role to play in the end times. And so the reason the United States is so heavily connected politically in Israel has been, well, traditionally it had been the only Middle Eastern democracy, but then also this view of, its importance in the end times. And so we've been heavily involved politically as a country because of that. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't support Israel, but we shouldn't be supporting it for those reasons, because that's not what the Bible teaches. So, this has had some political consequences, and sometimes it's even led people to justify Israel's actions, even though Israel might have been in the wrong. Certainly, Israel's been in a lot of conflicts with the Palestinians, and sometimes the Palestinians have been more of the aggressor. Sometimes Israel's been the aggressor. But those people that really believe in this end times thinking have this blind endorsement of Israel. And I don't think we should ever have a blind endorsement of anyone or anything. Certainly we want to support our allies as a country and work for the good of all people across the globe. But we shouldn't be blinded by a theology that doesn't have good support. So we need to be very mindful of that when we hear all this rhetoric about Israel, is that often it's motivated by this assumption that they have a role to play in the end times. And so support of Israel is not about supporting the Israelis. It's not about supporting the Jews. It's supporting what they think is this end times. So we need to be mindful of that, is that this is kind of bled over into our politics and shapes a lot of our politics without some of us even recognizing that. Any last questions? I know, if you weren't here last week, you might not have too much of what we talked about, but are there any last questions or comments related to this notion of the role of Israel? Yes, David pointing out this idea that the creation of Israel was under this idea of returning Jews to the promised land. Well, God's fulfilled all his promises to Israel. And so, not that it was necessarily something that needed to be done to help God out. God had fulfilled all of his promises to the physical people of Israel. If there's nothing else, let's turn then to talking about another aspect, two interrelated aspects. the Antichrist and the Battle of Armageddon. Often two very interconnected concepts. Will there be a one-world ruler that will arise, who will actually be on the side of the forces of evil, right, supported by Satan? And will there be an end times battle, right, the last battle between good and evil, between God and Satan? Very, very prominent in a lot of theologies, a lot of popular culture, movies. A lot of people buy into this, and a lot of people make a lot of money off of getting people to buy into these things. Let's start first with the Antichrist. So the assumption here is that at some point in the future, there will be a person who will arise, who will end up kind of taking over the world. It will bring all the nations of the world together and will rule over them. There will be kind of a support for this at first, but only later will it become evident that this person is actually evil and working on the intent of evil. There have been various times in history, especially in the 20th century, where people have suspected, right, this is getting ready to happen. So when the European Union began developing, there was a concern that this was providing the foundation for the Antichrist to arise. The United Nations, when it developed, and even today, as the United Nations gets involved in a variety of political things, people say, okay, it's moving towards the Antichrist. The Antichrist is going to come through the United Nations. Now, sometimes people will talk about one Antichrist, and sometimes they'll talk about two. Those that believe in two Antichrists believe that there will be a political figure who will kind of take over the world, and there will be a religious figure, a religious Antichrist, who will kind of unite a lot of the people of the world under a one world religion, a religion that's kind of a mixture of all the current religions. Now remember, in the concept here for a lot of people, the assumption is that this person's going to arise around the time of the rapture, around the time that will lead into the tribulation, and so the world's Christians will be mostly gone at this point. We, of course, have already looked at that issue and called that into question. But will there be a dictator, so to speak, that develops and rises at that point? There are a couple of passages that people will point to that they would claim testify or prophesy the arising of this person. One of the major ones is the passage from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, referring to the man of lawlessness or the man of sin. Paul writes there, this is from the English Standard Version, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And you know what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he's out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth, and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception from those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness." And so a lot of people believe that this passage is teaching about this man of sin, this man of lawlessness. This is the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will arise. He'll kind of put himself against God. He'll have power. He'll have signs and wonders that he will do in opposition to God, and he will deceive people. We'll look at another passage here in a minute, but there's a couple things to note with respect to this. Paul says, writing to first century Thessalonica, it is already at work. Right? So it was already at work in the first century. What he was talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. was already beginning in the first century. And the Thessalonians knew what he was talking about. He had expressed that to them. So it's important to see that that already we're talking about things that had taken place in the first century. So unless there is somebody around that is 2,000 years old, we might originally begin to question whether this passage is referring to a coming world ruler. Additionally, we should note that there are a couple of other things that people will say this passage is about. They'll say that this refers to the Pope. It doesn't refer to the Pope. Because, again, Paul said it was already at work, and there was no Pope. Despite what our Catholic friends might say, historically there was no Pope until the 4th or 5th century. There was not something going on in the 1st century that reflects the papacy. So, we're already kind of suspicious, or should be, as to whether this passage is referring to some sort of future ruler. Another passage, though, that is related to this is John's visions in Revelation chapter 13 of two beasts. And it's out of these two beasts that people will sometimes say there will be a political antichrist and a religious antichrist. We're going to look at most of chapter 13 here to kind of get the picture of what they're talking about. And so John writes, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?' And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all who dwell on the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain." So there are a couple of things out of this passage, right? That the beast is going to be over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Right? We know he's on the bad side because he's in league with the dragon. Chapter 12 tells us the dragon is Satan. Right? So anybody on the side of the dragon is on the side of evil. But there will be this deception that the beast will convince, people will be convinced to worship the beast. The second beast is described a few verses later, beginning in verse 11. "Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain." So the second beast exercises religious functions, encourages people to worship the first beast. It has 2 horns like a lamb, right? It looks good, but it speaks like a dragon, right? Again, the dragon Satan. The question where you get the debate, of course, is this worship leader, so to speak, going to be another power, or is it just going to be somebody that's supporting a singular antichrist? Is this what Revelation is teaching? As we've mentioned before, especially with Revelation, it has to make sense to those first century Christians originally before we attempt to make any sort of application to us today. So would a prophecy of a coming world ruler thousands of years away from their time, who's going to persecute a completely separate group of people, would that have meant anything to help them with the persecution they were enduring? Because in chapter 1 of Revelation, John talks about the persecution that both he and the members of the churches of Asia are experiencing. I don't know that that necessarily would be comforting. If the goal of Revelation is to comfort those people first, to tell them about things that are going to happen in the future to a completely different group of people, it doesn't seem to me that that itself would be comforting to those first century Christians. But in addition, there are other things that John says about this first beast that I think we need to pay attention to. And those come in Revelation chapter 17. In Revelation chapter 17, John sees a prostitute. And the prostitute is sitting on the back of the first beast. And so we're given a little bit more of a description of this first beast in chapter 17. John writes there beginning in verse 3, and then we'll drop down to verse 9. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to the destruction. And I didn't include this, but we probably should have included verse 18 of that chapter, which says, "The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." So Revelation 17, John gives us some keys to understand that first beast. Here are the keys. The woman sitting on the first beast represents a city. Right? It says woman means city. Right? It's a city that rules over the peoples of the earth. Okay. This city sits on a beast that has 7 heads, 10 horns. John tells us, says heads, it means hills. Says heads, it means kings. Right? So the heads represent hills, represents kings. And so the woman, it is a city seated on 7 hills. What about these 7 kings, though, John? 5 of them have fallen, says John. 1 is. So what city that ruled over the nations of the world, that existed at the time that John was writing, would fit this? It's got to be Rome. So what's the beast that Rome is seated on? It's got to be the Roman emperors. So the first beast isn't some coming world ruler. The first beast, the Roman empires. This passage doesn't prophesy things about what are going to happen in our future. It's about things that happened to John's future, but it's our past. So we're not looking for some antichrist to kind of take over the world. Well, that's not what Revelation 13 teaches. But what about that second beast? Well, what's that second beast do? It gets people to worship the first beast. The first beast, Roman Empire, Roman emperors. Did people worship the Roman emperors by the first century? Yeah, they did. Right? We sometimes refer to it historically as the cult of emperor worship. So John's warning them, don't get trapped, don't get wrapped up in this cult of emperor worship. Don't get wrapped up, right, in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is motivated by the dragon. The dragon is Satan. So Revelation 13 isn't about our future, it's about our past. And symbolically telling those first century Christians about not compromising with the Roman Empire. So we have to be careful with some of these passages because they don't teach what sometimes people claim that they teach. Additionally, a third part of this, right? So we have questions about this man of sin. I'll tell you, I have no idea what that man of sin, man of lawlessness is. I can tell you what it's not. And part of the reason I can't tell you is because the Thessalonians had information we don't have. Paul says in that passage, you know these things. I told you about them while I was there. Right? So he told the Thessalonians what he's talking about. I can only tell you what the passage says. I can't tell you much beyond that. I can tell you what it's not. It's not the Pope. It's not an Antichrist. But what about this Antichrist? The phrase is used several times, only though in John's letters. It's used 4 times in Scripture, only in John's letters, and only, well, predominantly in the plural, antichrists. So when John talks about antichrists, what's he talking about? Is he talking about a coming one-world ruler? Verse 18 of chapter 2. Children, it is the last hour. As you have heard that Antichrist is coming. That's the only time really that it's singular. So now many antichrists have come. John says, I'll tell you about the Antichrist. There's a bunch of antichrists now. Right, when he's writing, late first century. From this we know that it is last hour. They went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But by going out, they made it plain that none of them belonged to us. Right? So these antichrists that John's talking about are people that had left the first century church. They believed some false things. Verse 22. What did they believe? Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. Who's the Antichrist, John? The Antichrist is that person that denies Jesus is the Messiah. All right, evidently, some people within those communities that John is writing to denied that, and so they had left. He further says, chapter 4, verse 3, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming. Oh, I was wrong. There's another time it's singular. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world. What's the spirit of the Antichrist, John? Not only to deny Jesus is the Christ, but to deny that he's from God. And then 2 John and verse 7. Many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So they don't believe Jesus is the Christ. They don't claim Jesus is from God. And they don't believe Jesus came in the flesh. That's the Antichrist. That's what it means to be an Antichrist. Not some one-world ruler. Not some dictator that's coming to arise. It's those people that were a part of the community of faith, part of the church, that for whatever reason denied that Jesus was fully human, that denied that Jesus was from God, denied that Jesus was the Christ. And so it has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with what the nature of Jesus is. Questions or comments? Anything that we need to clarify or maybe explore a little bit more fully? Jim? That's a good question. Jim's asking, what's the difference about the beast coming out of the sea and the beast coming out of the earth? There probably is one. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Some people have suggested that the sea suggests that John is using the sea as kind of a symbol for the struggling. What's the word I'm looking for? It's humanity, but it's kind of this spiritual struggling we have, and the earth is more kind of this political type of thing. I'm not sure exactly what the differences are. Maybe it doesn't matter. Again, I can't tell you everything from Revelation. There's a lot I don't know. Yeah. The Message might use the honcho antichrist. The Message translation might say honcho. They take a lot of liberties with that. Other questions or comments? Kind of connected as well with the Antichrist, before we get to the Battle of Armageddon, we've already done some conclusions, is 666. Let's talk about 666. If you were here for the hymn sing on Friday, we sang hymn number 665. We sang hymn number 667, but nobody got up and led hymn number 666, which is really a good song. I mean, it's probably one that not too many of us know. It's 666 in our songbook. It's also, if you've ever seen the, what's the other one? Songs of Faith and Praise. It's 666 in that songbook as well. So it's the spacious firmament on high. And so I think it's, right, it's a very complicated song to sing, got some really interesting harmonies and patterns in it, and so I guess all these hymn book compilers have just said, nobody's ever going to sing this song, stick it at 666. But there is kind of a lot of mystery, trepidation, fear connected with this. I made the comment a couple weeks ago about people who are concerned when their bill comes to $6.66, right? You either pump a little bit more gas or you buy a pack of gum or something like that. And after I said that, several of you came up and shared some things with me about people you knew. I was applying for a job at the University of Central Florida to teach at the University of Central Florida, which is where I was before I came here. And the morning of my interview, I stayed at the hotel. They said, go ahead and have breakfast at the hotel, and then charge it to your room. We'll take care of it. And I was there for a job teaching religion. It was in a philosophy department, so I'm there for a job teaching religion. And so I went down. They had a buffet, but I looked at the buffet, and I was like, there's really not a lot that I'd want here. I'm just going to order off the menu. And my bill came to $6.66. All right, so here I'm applying for a job in religion. My bill's $6.66. I got the job anyway, so I guess that didn't work against me. But there's some concern about this number, and people have offered all sorts of things about this number. It is not related to a supercomputer in Belgium. The mark of the beast is not some sort of chip implant, right, that you're going to get, and that's how you're going to, instead of a card, you're going to scan your chip in your hand. It's not barcodes, right? People believed that it was barcodes when they first started being used. It's not Ronald Wilson Reagan, right? There were 6 letters in his first name, 6 in his middle name, and 6 letters in his last name. So people said Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist. So there are a lot of things that people have said, right? This is the mark of the beast. This is who the Antichrist is. let's look at the passage that talks about 666. This is about the second beast. And so when it says it there, it's the second beast. And it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the number of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. A couple things to kind of keep in mind when starting off this passage. In chapter 12 of Revelation, we're introduced to the dragon. As I said, John tells us, the dragon, Satan. And then we're introduced to these two beasts, the first beast, the second beast, who work for Satan. So essentially we have here, we might use, if we use the term Trinity, right, a counterfeit Trinity, right, kind of a false representation of the Godhead. Right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, then you have the dragon and the two beasts. In chapter 7, the angels seal the servants of God on the forehead. And the servants of the beast are marked on the right hand or the forehead. So this is kind of counterfeit, right? Everything Satan tries to do is counterfeit of what God does. Right? So already we kind of said there's a greater theological picture behind this, about what Satan does. But what about this number? Well, there have been a couple of people that have attempted to suggest what this means. There are three basic options. Now, obviously, with anything, there are a bunch of divisions within those options, but there's three general interpretations. One is that it has something to do with the length of the beast, how long the beast is going to be in power. Now, often this is connected with the assumption that the beast, the first beast, is the Antichrist. Right? And so it's about the length of the Antichrist's reign. Other people say, and it specifically stands in for the Antichrist. Right? It's pointing to who the Antichrist is going to be. Right, so one is kind of, it's more how long he's going to be in power. The other is that it's more going to be about the Antichrist himself. Still others, however, suggest that it's representative of an ancient practice known as gematria. All right, so what's gematria? Well, gematria is an ancient practice of converting letters of the alphabet into numbers, bringing those numbers together to represent phrases or names. In both Hebrew and Greek, there were not numbers. And so the letters of Hebrew and Greek stood in for numbers. And so as you went down through the alphabet, each number or each letter had a numeric value. So Aleph was 1, Beit was 2, Gimel was 3, Dalet was 4, down to 10, and then you went 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, right down to 100, and then it was 200, 300, 400. And so if you wanted to write a number, you had to include all those letters, right? So, if you wanted to write an 11, you would have to include the letter for 10 and the letter for 1, and that would be 11. Right? So there's that general practice of trying, there's numerical values. Well, people would use this for other types of purposes as well. For example, there was graffiti that's been discovered in Pompeii. Right? Pompeii, fossilized in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. There was graffiti found there in Pompeii that says, "I love her whose number is 545." And so essentially it's this woman, right, that this graffiti artist was in love with. If you took all the letters of her name, put them together, it added up to 545. There was a verse of the time kind of antagonizing the Emperor Nero, that said, Nero, Orestes, Alcmaeon, their mothers slew, a calculation new. Nero, his mother, slew. In Greek, both the name Nero and the phrase his mother slew total to 1,005. All right, so this person is kind of making a play off of gematria. So the third number is, or the third option is that 666 gives us a clue to the name of the first beast, or the name of something related to the first beast. Now, going from a number back to a name is a challenge. All right? If you have a name, you can figure out the number. But just giving you a number, there's a lot of combinations that can work together to give you a number. And so gematria is probably the most likely option for a couple of reasons. John says at the beginning of verse 18, this calls for wisdom, right? So you have to pay attention. There's some wisdom needed here to understand this. Let anyone with understanding calculate. So by using the word calculate, he's telling you, I'm giving you a gematria. I'm giving you something about this beast. And so the number 666 is gematria. It's the name of somebody. Well, okay. All right. The best option I've seen is that it is a gematria for the Emperor Nero. Particularly Nero's name in Hebrew, Neron Caesar, which looked perfectly well on my computer at home. Right now you should be staring at the Hebrew of Neron Caesar. All of those letters, you've only gotten one of them. I don't know why that one worked and the rest of them didn't. So this is Hebrew, and you might say, okay, New Testament, we're writing in Greek. Why are we talking about Hebrew? You really want to understand Revelation, you need to know your Old Testament. Out of the 404 verses in Revelation, 287 of them contain allusions to the Hebrew Scriptures. Over half of the verses contain allusions to the Old Testament. John expected his readers to know the Old Testament. So if you're going to give a clue, why put it in Greek that everybody can understand? You put it in Hebrew so the person that has wisdom can help. If you look at it, and I'm thinking these letters aren't going to show up either. Well, those letters showed up, but the numbers didn't show up. So that first letter on there equals 50. The second letter, Resh, equals 200. Vav equals 6. The second Nun equals 50 as well. Kaf is 100. Samek is 60. Resh is 200. Right, you total those letters up, you get to 666. What's even stranger about it is if you look at your footnotes, you might have a note that says some manuscripts have 616. Now, most manuscripts have 666, so it's most likely that John wrote 666, but somehow 616 showed up in some manuscripts. Wouldn't that blow everybody's mind if 616 is actually the problematic? Neron Caesar, in Hebrew, you could drop that second N and still spell it correctly. That second N is worth 50. 616. Now again, I'm not saying absolutely because I don't think we can be absolutely sure, but it seems to me that Nero is probably the most likely. But I believe Revelation was written in the 90s. Nero's been dead 30 years. Right? So why is he talking about Nero? the latter part of the first century, there was a belief that went around the Roman Empire that Nero was coming back to life. It was known as the Nero Redivivus myth. People in the eastern part of the Roman Empire refused to believe that Nero was dead, and there were rumors that he was going to return. And for those later decades, there were edicts that were circulated in Nero's name. In July of 69, a look-alike thought to be Nero was killed by a governor in the Roman Empire. In the 80s, there was a second pretender. He actually received the backing of the Parthians, which was an empire outside Rome, which was, in the first century, it was their constant enemy. He tried to depose the emperor Titus. In 88-89, there was a third pretender, backed by the Parthians, who was eventually turned over to the Romans. And so there was this constant thing throughout the end of the first century about Nero's coming back. Now, did John believe Nero was coming back? No. What's he telling us? Or what's he telling them? That there was going to be somebody like Nero. And he was going to do some things to those Christians, so watch out. And there was somebody. The Emperor Domitian was just as bad, if not worse, than Nero. And so I believe, right, that Nero is the most likely candidate. But even if you don't agree with that, you must understand within the context of Revelation 13, they knew what he was talking about. And so it can't be something in the future that we have to worry about. Right? And so if your bank wants to put a chip on your debit card, it's okay. Right? Or anything else that people will come up with. Right? Now, certainly, we still have to have the same kind of message of don't compromise with Satan. But we don't need to worry about an Antichrist or the mark of the beast. Thank you for your willingness to let me go a couple minutes over, but I wanted to finish that up. Lord willing, next week we will talk about the Battle of Armageddon. If you've been here a couple weeks, I think you can probably figure out what the conclusion is going to be. We seem to be constantly saying, here's what it says, but next week, Lord willing, we'll pick up with the Battle of Armageddon. I mean, talking about it, not actually having it.